Today we have the pleasure of welcoming a special speaker, internal speaker, to celebrate the publication of her new book. And the books will be there at the end by the end of the talk, and you can purchase the book, and she'll be happy to sign on the book. The speaker today is Professor Amal Hassan Fadlalla. She is in the Anthropology department, Women's Studies, Afroamerican and African Studies department. Clearly she's in high demand. Everyone wants a piece of her appointment. And she's been here at the University of Michigan for years. And she's an accomplished scholar who has published at least a half dozen books and volumes that she authored or co-authored or co-edited. And she works in the areas of gender, health, reproduction, diaspora, transnationalism, human rights, humanitarianism, all those issues that are relevant to our center, Human Rights Center. And one of the goals of when we established our center, one of the goals was to encourage more interaction among faculty and students who are interested in those human rights issues but are kind of scattered across campus and really don't know each other that well. And one of the main pleasure that I received was to get to know her, and now we have her here today to talk about her new book, Branding Humanity, Competing Narratives of Rights, Violence, and Global Citizenship. She has been recognized by a lot of awards from Rockefeller Foundation, the Population Council, Harvard Population Development Center, the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm not going to name all of them, but she's a highly regarded expert on human rights and humanitarianism, as well as African society, especially Sudan. And Sudan, as you know, is a country that we pay a lot of attention to, we in the human rights community. Many of you probably heard about the Darfur genocide, and that really put Sudan on the map in a bad way, but it did. And that was West Sudan, and then South Sudan became independent. But we hear every few years, or every few months even, we hear some warning signs about how South Sudan might break into some kind of civil war, and serious human rights violations could be expected or anticipated. So it's sort of a hotspot country for human rights issues, and I can't think of anybody better, more knowledgeable, nobody with more expertise than Professor Fadlalla. So it's a pleasure to welcome her to talk about her new book and talk about human rights in Sudan and other issues. So please join me in welcoming Professor Fadlalla.
Thank you very much, Keo, for this great introduction. And I want to also thank Donia Human Rights for hosting this lecture and this book launch today. So I have been touring with this book since October, so it's great to bring it home twice. This is my second talk at the University of Michigan, so I'm very happy to be here today. Thanks to all of you who helped organize this event today. So before I begin, I want to give you just a brief background about my talk today. So as I said, I'm going to talk from the book. So the book is based on intensive and extensive field work that I did with Sudanese activists and their allies in the United States, especially in Washington, D.C. area, and in the Sudans and online. And I did much of this field work during the tense debate about Sudanese civil wars and conflicts, and before Sudan split into two nation states in 2011. So this slide here just presents some important dates that explain, this context, especially the longest civil war between northern and southern Sudan that started right after independence until a peace deal was signed in 2005. And then as this debate about South Sudan was going on, Darfur conflict escalated in 2003. And then, Sudan, the peace deal that was signed between the North and the South ultimately led to the division of the country into two nation states. So now we have Sudan and South Sudan. So it is during this tense debate about wars and conflict that I did my fieldwork some years ago. So it's a very long-term project. So this debate was very tense then, particularly among various elite groups, including Islamists, including secularists, and including human rights and humanitarian activists in the Sudan and in the United States. So many academics, many policymakers, and human rights activists argued that these situations of wars and conflicts were fueled by ethnic divisions in the country. So in the book, I look at these debates and show that many human rights and humanitarian campaigns mobilize the symbol rhetoric of ethnic divisions, ethnic suffering, and gender-based violence to raise awareness about Sudanese conflicts. Unfortunately, this simplistic understanding ended up reproducing difference instead of transcending difference. So this is to say, instead of looking at ethnic boundaries to promote diversity and to think about diversity as a good thing to unite the Sudanese nations, the mobilization of ethnic and gender boundaries created new boundaries, especially in the diaspora. So to refresh your memory, I want to remind you of how situations of war and situation of conflicts in the Sudan were framed by various campaigns in the US along the divisive lines of Muslim, Arab Sudanese who were fighting black Christians in South Sudan or fighting black Muslims in Darfur. So this rhetoric of bad Muslims and good Christian blacks, or bad Arab Muslims and good Muslim blacks in Darfur became more visible and more effective after the tragic events of 9/11 in the United States. So in my discussion of this reproduction of difference, I show how these mobilizations created master narratives that did not take into account the voices of many secular Sudanese activists in the Sudan and in the diaspora who are still fighting for an inclusive citizenship project, as evident in the ongoing demonstrations that are taking place in the Sudan right now. And this demonstration started in December 2018 and are still going on in the Sudan. So these are the same kind of secular activists who were fighting in the Sudan and in the diaspora for an inclusive citizenship project. So to explain these intricate issues, I want to focus on the gender side of this debate to show how this political debate over ethnic conflicts and ethnic violence manipulated women's bodies and vulnerabilities to address a broader issue. And this broader issue is actually a clash over the meanings of national and transnational citizenship rights and belonging. And I want to explain this clash with an eye on this particular historical moment and what it means to talk about the production and the circulation of human rights stories and how they influence activism, and how these also sensational and simplistic stories about rights, how they travel, how they shape other practices, and how they often fall into the trap of identity politics that fragment rather than unite. So to clarify all of this, I am going to use the stories of two Sudanese women. Halima from Darfur and Sanaa from Northern Sudan. And although I don't agree, or I don't, I don't like to use this kind of terminology, like this person is from Darfur and this person is from Northern Sudan, but I want to use them to kind of reproduce how, or to represent how this campaign used ethnic identity politics. So I'm going to use these two stories to show how different social actors and activists produced, circulated, and re-articulated human rights stories of ethnic suffering and gender-based violence to seek inclusion in both national and transnational imagined communities. And I want to begin by the first story, Halima Story. So the story goes like this. On Human Rights Day, December 10th, 2008, a Darfurian woman using the pseudonym Halima Bashir entered the Oval Office to meet with President George Bush. Halima appeared before the White House press wearing a colorful Sudanese body wrap. We call it tobe. Her face was veiled to protect her identity because she feared that the Sudanese authorities might harm her family in Darfur. Halima presented President Bush with her recently published biography, Tears of the Desert, a memoir of survival in Darfur, which she co-authored with well-known British author and journalist Damian Lewis. In the book, Halima details her rape and abuse by the Khartoum government militia in Darfur when she worked as a volunteer medical doctor in the refugee camps. During the White House press conference, Halima was introduced as a human rights activist and described by President Bush as a good soul who brought first-hand accounts to what life is like in Darfur. So using Halima's story, President Bush committed to delivering aid to Darfur. He also made important policy announcements. He, for instance, commended the United Nations and the African Union on their joint efforts to send troops to Darfur and urged for more expediency in other UN peace processes related to the conflict. Moreover, he warned President Bashir of the Sudan that he would not escape accountability for committing crimes against humanity in Darfur. He also announced the appointment of a special envoy to Sudan and urged the international community to put more pressure on the Sudanese government and the warring parties to resolve the conflict and to facilitate the work of humanitarian agencies. Bush declared, the urgency of the situation is never more apparent than when I had the honor of visiting with this brave soul. Halima then thanked the president and stressed that the International Criminal Court, the ruling against the Sudanese president should be upheld to stop the genocide and atrocities in the region. So the story of Halima is not the only one. The story of Halima is one of the many master narratives produced and circulated by many human rights activists within the various humanitarian publics that I documented in the book. Most of these humanitarian publics make visible alliances among various American faith-based groups, celebrities, students, and Sudanese human rights activists. Here, identity politics and solidarity with Sudanese activists privileged the transnational framework of rights in order to find solutions for conflicts in South Sudan and conflicts in Darfur. Now, in these humanitarian publics, many activists produced and circulated stories such as that of Halima, using the trope of ethnic suffering and gender-based violence to engage policymakers. So in the book, I show how the simplistic and divisive representation of ethnic suffering and gender-based violence dominated the media sphere and also dominated various humanitarian spaces and created unique production of knowledge in the forms of documentaries, popular books, and other non-academic material that dealt with questions of identity and question of diversity in very dramatic storytelling styles. And this slide just gives you, examples of this huge production of suffering that I documented and I also examined to see how these stories influence activist practices. So to understand the influence of these stories on activism and policy making, as we saw in the case of Halima and how President George Bush used it, I coined two terms. The first one is affective violence, and the second one is audio politics. And I coined these terms because I want them to help me understand, how these stories get produced, how they get circulated, and how they influence all these, how they influence policy making and how they influence activist practices. So both terms show how the production and circulation of these master narratives shape activist practices and influence decision-making processes. In other words, I show how this kind of narration enabled activists to mobilize and enabled policy makers to listen, to respond, and to intervene in Sudanese conflicts. So as we saw in the case of Halima Bashir, how President Bush responded to her story and how he used it to make important decision-making policies. And here also you see an example of George Clooney briefing Obama on Sudan in 2010. So in many humanitarian publics where these stories circulate and inspire debates and contestation, I also look at how victims of conflicts, such as Halima, are educated to become human rights and humanitarian activists, and how to also become role models. So these activists and role models perform humanity in public by using the same sensational stories of violence and the same sensational stories of suffering to raise awareness about conflicts, to raise money for aid, or to build their own humanitarian organization. So to explain this point further, let's come back to Halima's master narrative again and examine how it was produced and how it circulated and how it influenced her activism and her role as a leader in the human rights field. First, I want to remind you that Halima Story is narrated and translated by British journalist Damian Lewis. Now, Lewis is very famous for producing this genre of translated suffering based on his own experience of covering conflicts and wars in Africa and the Middle East. So this genre positioned him as the narrator, translator, and co-author of individual men and women's stories of suffering and survival. So the protagonists in these narratives are often represented as heroes and heroines, as role models and iconic symbols of bravery, healing, and anti-corruption. In the most triumphant cases, they become human rights and humanitarian activists themselves, and their stories serve, as I mentioned before, as geopolitical techniques that help activists, politicians, and policymakers respond, act, and intervene. For instance, in Tears of the Desert, we learned that Halima, a medical doctor and a graduate of the University of Khartoum in the Sudan, was subject to sexual violence by Khartoum security forces in Darfur. Because of this trauma, she was smuggled by an agent through Khartoum airport into London. In London, she joined her husband and cousin. His name is Sharif, who himself is a renowned Darfurian rebel leader. By the end of the story, we are told that Halima was finally granted asylum with other members of her family and now lives with her husband and 2 sons in London. Now, after the release of Tears of the Desert, Halima appeared in various high-profile media venues wearing a black burqa, and sometimes wearing burqa with big black glasses to protect her identity and to talk about her ordeal. But what I noted in the different interviews she gave to the media was how discussion of her rape was downplayed and articulated as part of violent African cultural norms, similar to female circumcision, similar to henna, similar to veiling, slavery, and tribalism. So there is no historical context, just this representation. So there is a reason, of course, for telling Halima's story in this way. There is a reason for telling Halima's story in this way. First of all, Halima's narrative is constructed in a way familiar to Western audiences' understanding of Africa as a place of suffering. Second, the story is also told in a way that renders it more credible and legible as deserving international attention, because sexual violence is regarded as a crime against humanity, according to human rights and humanitarian legal and moral codes. Indeed, Halima's story and its rendering in Tears of the Desert, which has been translated into 30 languages, facilitated her passage into and through the otherwise inaccessible corridors of media corporation and policymakers, and granted her the often capricious recognition of both national and global citizenship affiliation in the West. But an important question emerges here when we read such sensational stories. What does this singular, feminized story leave untold about the complex context of its production when we read Sudan's contemporary history? So in the context of the Sudan, and since the Islamists came to power in the late 80s, Sharia moral codes, Islamic rules, have presented a new model for national identity. And this national identity was linked to a pan-Islamist transnational vision about solidarity. At the same time, many transnational actors, including Sudanese opposition members and activists, have relied on the circulation of narratives of ethnic and gender violence in their alliances and contestation of the Islamist state. So, for Sudanese state actors, for the Islamists, alliances with non-Western countries and with the Muslim world enabled them to assert the sovereignty of the Islamic state. And for those in the opposition, Western-based alliances enabled them to insert themselves in an imagined transnational community in order to envision an inclusive nation state. So the story of Halima, for example, highlights the tension and clash among these dominant narratives of transnational affiliations endorsed by the Islamists and their human rights and humanitarian rivals. But the problem of these two dominant visions, the Islamists on the one hand and the right-based humanitarianism on the other hand, is that they both work through assimilation and or exclusion of other Sudanese secular visions. Secular activists in the Sudan and abroad have contested and re-articulated these narratives to highlight their own marginal position as political opponents in the Sudan and as exiled migrants seeking safe transnational abodes. So to highlight the response of these immigrants, I will present the second story here, the story of Sanaa from Northern Sudan, to show you how the narratives produced within what I call diaspora publics work as counter-response to the master narratives produced within the various humanitarian publics that I just talked about. And the story goes as such. On May 30th, 2009, I drove to Maryland with two Sudanese community activists to meet with Sanaa Amin. Sanaa is a young Sudanese woman who was subject to severe burns on her face and body in the Sudan in 2005. As a young Northern Sudanese, she is a member of a new generation of youth who grew up under the current Islamist regime. Her discontent with her arranged marriage took a terrible turn when she resisted and escaped to her parents' house. Unfortunately, this form of resistance was an affront to her husband, who tricked one of her brothers into helping him win Sanaa back. Now, the husband used a well-known cultural practice of curing sickness with blessed water. We call it mahaya in Sudan. And he convinced Sanaa's brother to throw the mahaya, the liquid, over her body as she slept. Not realizing that the blessed water, the mahaya, is actually phosphoric acid, the brother did what he was told, and Sanaa's face and other body parts suffered third-degree burns. The story of the violence committed against Sanaa circulated quickly in national and international media, but was not picked up by Western-based human rights and humanitarian groups who celebrated the case of Halima Bashir. Sanaa's case was picked up and mobilized by a different group of liberal and secular Sudanese activists in the Sudan and in the diaspora. These groups also used Sanaa's story to point to what they called the complicity of the Sudanese state in fostering the violence of culture and tradition. So unlike the story of Halima Bashir, quote unquote, she is from Darfur, the story of Sanaa represents a Nazan story. She was born and raised in a small town in central Sudan, so she is considered to be a Muslim Arab Nazan Sudanese, according to the identity politics that framed the conflicts in South Sudan and in Darfur. Like Halima's story, Sanaa's story is also a production of a journalist. The Sudanese journalist, his name is Daya al-Ballal, one of the editors of Al-Raya al-Am, a prominent Sudanese newspaper, picked up the story and published it under the journal's humanitarian section, صفحة التحقيقات الإنسانية. After that, Sanaa's story circulated very fast in many news outlets, especially Arab news media. Soon after that, Sanaa was airlifted from the Sudan to the United Arab Emirates and then to the United States through a generous humanitarian grant from Sheikha Fatma bint Mubarak, the widow of late Sultan Zayed of United Arab Emirates. Sheikha Fatma is known as the mother of Emirates, al-Amarat. She is also the head of the Emirates Women's Union and the honorary president of the Red Crescent, the well-known humanitarian organization in the Muslim world. When Sanaa arrived in the United States, she was officially received by the Emirates ambassador in DC. Later, members of the Sudanese diaspora in Virginia organized a reception for her, and they also organized concert to support her case. For instance, this one event that I attended bore the slogan "من أجل سناء وحتى آخر النساء," for Sanaa until the liberation of the last woman. And it was a demonstration of unity and solidarity among community activists who spoke about violence against women in the Sudan and how to devise strategies to combat it. I later met with Sanaa and followed her lengthy medical recovery in the US. So, the story of Sanaa is not the first of its kind. Tragically, there were other cases of women who suffered similar attacks. Furthermore, crimes of retaliation by phosphoric acid, although statistically are not many and also not confined to women, there are few cases that emerge in the media where acid was also used in revenge attacks between male business partners. So why Sanaa? Why the focus on Sanaa's case and on this different kind of violence against women? So the answer to this question goes like this. First of all, the focus on violence against women here highlights an important global transformation. It shows how the language of gender-based violence, how it travels, and how it infuses the practices of many NGOs working on women's issues in the Sudan and in Africa in general. Many feminists in the Sudan told me that their agendas have shifted in recent years to include gender-based violence, to conform to the United Nations feminist agenda, and to draw funding for their own campaigning missions. So for the UN and other transnational organizations, gender-based violence became a salient category in the 80s and in the 90s to describe various forms of violence against women. Although other kinds of violence are acknowledged in this transnational feminist agenda, attention is often given to sexual violence and not to other kinds of violence and gender discrimination. So Sanaa's case gave some feminists and activists in the Sudan and in the diaspora a chance to highlight this other kind of violence as a counter response to the master narrative of sexual violence. Indeed, after the production and circulation of Sanaa's story, several Sudanese feminists and journalists wrote about her case, calling for revisions of the legal codes and the personal status laws that govern issues of marriage and divorce. In the existing personal status code, they argued women are granted some liberties, but are still subjected to male patriarchal authority. As a woman, Sanaa is subject to male authority, but her family is also subject to economic marginalization that exacerbate cultural biases against women. And the arguments went on and on. So this is just one example to show you how activists also use Sanaa's case as a counter response from the diaspora. I'll give you another case to elaborate on this point. So other activists in the Sudan and in the diaspora, they also use Sanaa's story to give different meanings to this idea of humanity and this idea of social care. And by this I mean that, you know, the underlying idea behind humanitarian aid is to take care of people during conflict and during crisis, right? So many Sudanese activists responded by invoking their own cultural practices of charity and solidarity. Many asserted that, well, you know, social care is part and parcel of Sudanese culture of aid and support, of course. One example that activists in the Sudan and in the diaspora deployed is this culture of what they called nafir. And nafir is plural of the Sudanese Arabic word nafar. Nafar is the individual. So in situation of crisis and in situation of need, the individual, the nafar, is mobilized to join the community in order to provide care and to provide assistance. So nafir, brand of humanitarianism, enables activists and community members in the Sudan and abroad to insert these cultural forms of social solidarities and craft a response that critiques the hegemonic representation of humanitarianism. And these are just two examples, you know, to show you how activists mobilize this nafir form to kind of, you know, assist people back home and in the diaspora. So this is a nafir for flood victims in Khartoum in 2003. And this is, you know, just, you know, the event preparing for that concert. So, so in these nafir gatherings, Sudanese exile celebrities and artists, musicians and singers and other elite, they all come together to raise funds in situations of crisis and need in the Sudan and in the diaspora. So by using diaspora as counter-response to the master narratives that circulated in many humanitarian publics, I am arguing that the practices of many Sudanese in the diaspora are also humanist. By humanist, I mean that they present different meanings of humanity and different meanings of social care. Secular Sudanese, whether Muslims or non-Muslims and hailing from different parts of the Sudan, transform their community spaces in order to respond to the exclusion they encounter both in hegemonic representation of Islam and hegemonic representation of rights-based humanitarianism. So in the book, I look at what all these different actors and activists try to achieve by invoking these ideas of rights, ideas of humanity and care. So all of them, including Sudanese diaspora activists who invoke nafir and other communal forms, are trying to find neutral spaces, ones that are not corrupted by official politics and political violence, in order to talk about inclusion in national and transnational citizenship frameworks. But as anthropologists have long pointed out, our feelings are hardly removed from various webs of power and political economies. So these communal models, such as nafir, like the master narrative of humanitarianism, assume an apolitical stance that centers the politics of feeling as a strategy to contest the politics of the state, taking for granted the classist position of the giver. Sanaa herself succumbs to this politics when she explains to me that the condition of her humanitarian grant do not allow her to talk about politics. As she said to me, her case is pure humanitarian matter. I don't want to embarrass the sheikha because the sheikha was so kind to me. So through these unequal relations of gift giving and social care that naturalize poverty and other kinds of violence, new relations of bondage are created that, whether intentionally or not, silence other interpretations and other critiques. So, although there is no harm, of course, of mobilizing these different structures of feelings, love, compassion, care, the question becomes, how can we do that without silencing other critiques, especially critiques of the conditions that produce violence in the first place? So silencing militarism, silencing critique of poverty, of nativist understanding of citizenship, for instance, adds new injury to Sanaa and Halima's bodies by manipulating their vulnerabilities as a site of debate to heal a Sudanese nation pulled apart in different ideological directions. So when Sanaa unveiled her face to the media, many recognized her as a role model, as someone courageous using her story to teach a lesson to future generations. Her story also told a different humanitarian lesson that aims at healing injuries, albeit while concealing the politics of regional alliances, concealing the politics of militarism and competition over power and resources. So despite the similarities of Sanaa and Halima's cases, Halima's story sent a different message. First, none of my interlocutors identified the real woman behind the pseudonym Halima, but many recognized her story. One interviewee told me that he knew about her and that she had returned to the Sudan. Others told me that she is still married to the rebel leader and lives with her family in London, though I was not able to verify these stories. Halima's story, however, represents a resistance story of a Darfurian woman who sought alliance with a different kind of humanitarianism, a brand that to date remains in tension with the Islamist vision of sovereignty and governance in Sudan. That said, and before I conclude, I want to propose that we read these narratives in the political and historical moments that enabled their production and enabled their circulation. That said, it's important to note that these master narratives and counter narratives all surfaced in the media at the height of transnational activist mobilization against war atrocities in the Sudan, and that they all surfaced in the media in the post 9/11 war on terror. During this tense time, stories of suffering refugees, especially women, provided a gendered lens through which to debate Sudan's political conflicts, the legitimacy of the Islamist regime, and the country's place in a contested humanitarian order. So I argue that these different processes and these different mobilization provided the fertile ground and marked the right time for the separation of the Sudan into two nation state in 2011. And just as women's bodies have served as sites of national debate and negotiations, so too have the tensions dividing Sudan played on women's bodies. Sanaa and Halima's stories, for instance, reveal how national and transnational debate over rights, over humanity, and over social care, how this debate manifests on women's injured bodies before the country's division. So as we fight for rights, as we fight for inclusion, and as we fight for a humanist future, we also ought to remember that our strive for justice should not yield to existing social divisions, should not yield to conservative ideologies and nativist understanding of citizenship. Thank you.